स्थापकाय च धर्मस्य सर्वधर्मस्वरूपिणे अवतारवरिष्ठाय रामकृष्णाय ते नमः। योऽन्तःप्रविश्य मम वाचमिमां प्रसुप्तां सञ्जीवयति अखिलशक्तिधरस्वधाम्ना अन्यांश्च हस्तचरणश्रवणत्वगादीन् प्राणान् नमो भगवते पुरुषाय तुभ्यम्। Today's topic is a bit slightly academic in nature, that is Swami Vivekananda's historical perspectives. So many of us who are part of the Vedanta society, who are familiar with Vivekananda's teachings, looking upon Vivekananda as a great spiritual teacher, religious teacher, may not be aware of some of the original thinking that Swami Vivekananda had with regard to civilization, culture, history, and so on. And it requires some understanding of the latest trends in historiography to be able to value Vivekananda's contribution. Today there are two views, generally speaking, in Western world, with regard to the role of history. One is that history is the creation of some great men. That's one view, where you interpret history as something inspired by the personality, the teachings, the ideals that some great men stood for. You can think of the United States. Can you think of the United States without a man like George Washington? Or even to a greater extent, if you think of today's United States, can we think of this country without a great man like Abraham Lincoln? We can't think of it. So the role of great men is indisputable in the formation of a nation, a culture, or civilization. At the same time, circumstances also play some important role in shaping the destiny of history, in shaping the personality of a great man who inspires history. So they are in a way interrelated. Vivekananda's complete works present some very, very original thinking about history. You have to remember the time he went to the college and university in the later half of 19th century, where education meant specializing in philosophy, literature, and history. These were the three areas in which most of the elite universities of the world specialized. You won't be called an educated person unless you are familiar with the contemporary history, you are familiar with some of the great events that shaped the civilization of humanity, and also some of the fundamental teachings of the great personalities who influenced the world. Look at India. I mean, when we talk about Vedanta, it is unavoidable that we would talk about India. If you look at Indian history or Vedanta that we are supposed to represent right now, we cannot think of Vedanta or Hinduism today without thinking of three great men who shaped India's cultural destiny. One, Buddha, then Shankaracharya, then Vivekananda. So these three great personalities represent 24 centuries of India's cultural, spiritual evolution. And a part of that ongoing evolution manifested in the United States in 1893. Then Vivekananda came to this country to talk about Vedanta and Hinduism. And you can see the impact right now. To give one simple example, that I'm trying to bring home to you what I was trying to explain. Today, if you go to any part of the United States, you cannot talk to an educated audience, cultured, educated, refined people. You cannot talk to them about religion except in terms of some universal aspiration. You cannot address an educated audience in the United States or Europe today without telling that all religions contain some sparks of truth. Now, this was impossible even to conceive of before the first Parliament of Religion in 1893. And for the first time, historically speaking, according to American historians, for the first time the Western world listened to a new view on religion when Vivekananda came to this country and proclaimed on a platform where every single religion was represented. He said every religion is an equally valid path leading to God. There is no religion that is wrong. True religion is universal spiritual humanism. Spirituality means becoming a good human being. You will be a good human being if you pray to God, whatever that God might be, depending upon your own religious tradition, depending upon the book that you follow, the prophet whom you are inspired by. But when we meditate on God, when we think of God, when we claim to be religious, that should reflect in our interaction with our fellow human beings. In simple terms, it means being a good human being. You call it compassion, broad-mindedness, love, everything. All together you can put it. Now, this in a way, this was a totally non-theological definition of religion. This is the idea that Vivekananda did not invent. It was not his creation. It was there already in ancient Vedantic tradition. Buddha taught in his own style, he called it Buddhism. Shankaracharya taught in his own style, called Vedanta. Vivekananda in 19th century, he interpreted in terms of the universal spiritual humanism. So here you find certain circumstances inspired the emergence of a unique personality, and that unique personality again sets in forth an engine, a kind of chain reaction, which takes forward this spiritual idea. So without a man like Buddha, you cannot talk about, let's say, mindfulness. I shall give just one simple example, because this is a word that everyone knows, the phrase mindfulness, a word. Everyone knows about mindfulness. I had interaction with some doctors working for the Kaiser, some big medical insurance companies. They give orientation in mindfulness and meditation as part of an extracurricular program, maybe to consolidate their position as a medical practitioner, because that gives them additional grace marks, credits as a distinguished medical doctor. And then I found, they have written an article, that I found Buddha's name is nowhere mentioned. Now, you publish a book, Sermon on the Mount, never mentioning Jesus Christ. Can you imagine that? Can you write an article about Bible without mentioning Jesus Christ? Impossible. So mindfulness is nothing but a long discourse, it's a topic of a long discourse that Buddha gave to a group of monks and laymen on how to keep our mind in a state of perfect detachment, awareness, and quietude, tranquility, and peace. It's a long discourse. It's called the Satyupattana Sutta. The printed versions of this book are available. It's in Pali language. It's a very corrupted, unrefined form of Sanskrit. So, mindfulness without Buddha, Sermon on the Mount without Jesus Christ, you can't even think of. So that shows that if you detach a great teaching from a great personality, who is the source of that great teaching, the teaching itself loses its strength. So about the role of study of history, Vivekananda says, it is out of the past that future has to be molded. It is the past that becomes the future. Therefore, the more we study the past, the more glorious will be our future. Very similar to Edmund Burke, who said those who forget their past have no future. Burke mentioned this in the British Parliament much earlier than Vivekananda. So, but then, apart from this, he had some very, very original contribution to make to the study of history. In fact, Vivekananda's ideas on religion, education, social reform, culture, civilization, the concept of harmonization of the best of the Western Occidental values and the best of Eastern values. This is a unique concept. It is born out of his own conviction that history plays a very important role. The study of history plays a very important role in the formation of our culture, character, personality, and civilization. He says, every nation has its own unique contribution to make to the totality of human civilization. Every nation. Now, he made this statement while traveling in the United States, maybe sometime in 1896. And even when during his second visit to San Francisco in 1900, he made a similar statement. So, history has an important role to play. And then he says, every society, every nation, every culture has something unique about it, and that is contribution. You can just think of the formation of what we now call Americanness or American culture as we understand today. See, many of the European nations brought to this country their own cultural traditions, both good and bad. See, the French language, French cuisine, the British diplomatic tradition, the Italian music from Italy and Spain, the monastic traditions, the perfectionism in work from Germany, and even the great music, some of the other contributions they brought with the Russians who came to North Dakota and other places in the beginning of the 19th century. So you find every European nation who came to this country has made its own unique contribution to what you call the totality of European culture. So today, in today's world, if you go to Silicon Valley, you find so many temples, Hindu, Buddhist temples. They also make their own contribution. The concept of a temple with many deities. So sometimes when I attend the interfaith programs in this country, they ask this question: if you go to an Hindu temple, you find an army of gods and goddesses. So what's the significance of this? Recently, in an interfaith program, when this question was put to me, I told them, different concepts of the divine in Hinduism are different expressions of the same one divine reality. It is monism, going beyond monotheism. Monotheism believes in some great creator God who creates this world and listens to your prayers, takes care of the world, and so on. So different deities are different expressions of the same divine spark, the Advaita. Now, contrary to the Occidental concept of historical evolution, in the Oriental tradition, they believe in what they call cyclicism in history, means cycles. Human cultures, human civilizations do not move in a straight line progression. They move in cycles. We call it yugas and kalpas. So, at some point, maybe after several thousands of years, the existing civilization may vanish, and later on, the same civilization, same culture may re-emerge in a different form, with a different emphasis. There was a cyclic movement in world time, they believed. And so, Swami Vivekananda, he interpreted history, a progressive reading of the spirit into matter. Progressive reading of the spirit into matter. It's a very interesting definition which I want to explain little. There's a gradual evolution going on in humanity. There is a gradual evolution from gross to subtle. As we progress further, two types of progressions happen side by side. On the one hand, science and technology, what we call civilization, they move forward, they make great progress. On the other hand, what we call culture, inner refinement, also progresses. To give an example, very often high-tech civilization need not necessarily mean more evolved or more refined. To give an example, Hitler's Germany was the most advanced high-tech nation in Europe at that time, in 1930s. But in terms of refinement, we call it spiritual values, this was not true. So very often, high-tech progression, explosion or developments in communication, in science and technology, in productivity, need not necessarily reflect on inner refinement. So Vivekananda says, this reading of spirit into matter, he says, as we evolve further in modern high-tech comforts and discoveries, we should also make sure that these discoveries in external achievements should not indirectly cause damage to inner refinement. They should go together. So he says, for example, the history of civilization is a progressive reading of spirit into matter. The history of the world is in little acts sacrifice performed in every household. And then Vivekananda says, the individual is only a part of the lump of clay. A few interesting ideas I'm going to mention. In the first Chicago address, Vivekananda mentions a few interesting things about some historical episodes. That lecture was delivered in 1893, September 11. That's the first Chicago address, the opening address. 1893, September 11. Vivekananda was asked to speak on Hinduism, the World Parliament of Religion in Chicago, 1893, when this country was celebrating its 400th anniversary of the Columbus discovery of this continent in 1493 to 1893, 400 years. In that lecture, Swami Vivekananda mentioned some very interesting events in world history. Because he was representing Hinduism and Vedanta, he takes his perspectives from that standpoint. So he says, for example, he talks about the migration of Israelis, Jews, into India in the year 400 BC and also in 70 AD. Then he talks about the coming of early Syrian Christians in the 1st century AD. Many of you who have not read world history may not remember, may not be aware of the fact even that India welcomed the first diaspora, emigration of Jews from Israel in 4th century BC when the temple was destroyed by Assyrians. And again in 70 AD, the second diaspora came to India when Masada was conquered by the Romans. The 10th Legion destroyed Masada after the last stand. And a few survivors managed to escape. They came to India. They continued living to our times. And when they came, they were accepted, respected. They were given honor. They were given villages and temples. Those temples they converted to synagogues. We still stand there today. Again, the first Christian diaspora came around 51 AD, and Saint Thomas, the called Doubting Thomas, as he is well known among the disciples of Jesus Christ. And in the 7th century, when today's Iran was overrun by the Arabs, the Zoroastrians were massacred, put to genocide. So the survivors came to India in the 7th century AD, in the western coast. And there is something more interesting. That may be shocking to some of you, those who don't know history. That's why history is very important for us to remember. The second oldest Muslim temple stands in India. How many of us know? The Arabs used to have trade relationship with the western coast of India long before the emergence of Islam. The same Arabs, after they became Muslims, they came and then the local king allowed them to build a mosque. It's supposed to be the second oldest mosque in the world. It could Cheriman Masjid. It's 625 AD, around that time. Now, Swami Vivekananda refers to some of these events, not the entire thing, some of these events in his first Chicago address. And he says, if you look at history, you find that a people, a civilization that looks upon harmony instead of conflict, unity and oneness instead of contradiction, that civilization alone can retain and sustain higher spirituality. Now, to understand this history, you have to remember in 70 AD, the Jewish temple was destroyed. In AD 135, the Emperor Hadrian removed the Jews from Jerusalem. Then the diaspora got scattered around the world, and Julian again wanted to rebuild Jerusalem temple. Then 1453, Sultan Muhammad again, he conquered Constantinople. All these events, in a way, caused dispersal of people and cultures from that part of the country around the world. But very often people crossed the seas, went to distant lands and countries, and where they went, they tried to bring with them their own alien culture, and instead of merging with the host countries, the host civilizations, they came into conflict with them. But in India, what happened, there is one interesting story I can, so many episodes frequently mention historical books. That shows you how different cultures can merge together. In the 7th century AD, the Zoroastrians, the followers of Zoroaster, came to West Coast. They belong to a religion called Zoroastrian religion. Means they worship flame, fire god, Agni in Vedic language. So the priest came in front of the procession with a flame, because the flame is a metaphor for the divine in their tradition, their religion. They are no more to be found in today's Iran, but they originated in Persia, and it almost disappeared from 8th century AD onwards, because today's Iran was overrun by the Arabs around that time. All of them escaped to India, and they made great contribution to India's high-tech institution. Some of them became the most outstanding businessmen, industrialists, making tremendous contribution to India's industrial progress. Some of the most well-known one recently passed away. His name is Swami Tata. He is the founder of the Tata Industries. They got units all over Europe. But I mean to say, when their priest came holding a flame which represented their idea of God, the local king came to the seashore to welcome them and asked them, you can come here, stay here. They were given ownership of many villages. They were given buildings which they converted into their own religious temples. then what will be your contribution to this country? The king, in an unconventional way, asked this Buddhist question to the priest. The priest's response was something interesting. King, could you bring me a little milk in a dish, in a vessel? So the king had a vessel full of milk brought. Then can you bring some sugar? And the priest put the sugar and he stirred this dish full of milk. Like this, we will make this, just as sugar makes milk sweeter, more nourishing, we will make your country sweeter. Literally happened. That community produced the most outstanding industrialists in India. Also, they built many great high-tech institutions and universities. The same thing happened to Jewish diaspora. Made tremendous contribution to trade, very small in number, but they made tremendous contribution to trade and industry. So what I mean to say, Vivekananda says, as a historian's perspective, it's a very unconventional theory. Every nation, every society, every culture has something unique to itself. And that culture, that nation, it contributes its genius to the totality of human civilization. Nobody is excluded. So, again, Vivekananda has got some other interesting theories about history. He says, history is always the same. He says, history, the struggle against the law of nature. That's what he says. History, the struggle against the law of nature. This needs some explanation. If you look at the march of human civilization, it has been always the story of our struggle against nature, not external nature, not nature that includes ocean, rivers, mountains and valleys, no. Our own lower nature, that's what Vivekananda says. So every progress is made as part of our achievement in our struggle against our own lower nature. In every human being, there are two forces, the positive and the negative. The good, noble, spiritual, refined, full of compassion, kindness, understanding, that makes us good human beings. One. The other, the opposite of all this. So, the opposite of all this is what we call nature. When we fight against our own jealousy, we are fighting against our nature. I mean, one part of the nature, the negative aspect of our nature. When we fight against our own wrong emotions, our hatred, many people have hatred against others, against certain other cultures, traditions and races. We should fight against this hatred. So every great progress in history is a result of our struggle against our own lower nature. And again, instead of competition and mutual mistrust, we should focus on harmony and understanding. Harmonization, a friction-free blending of the positive elements of all cultures, of all nations. This is a very wonderful contribution of Vivekananda to the concept of interpreting history. Harmony and synthesis. When we believe in harmony and synthesis, then there is no competition. So you have to remember, on the one hand, he was talking as a serious student of history. You have to remember, when he went to college, many of the well-known books that are current today were not published. You know, this is long before Toynbee, Will Durant, and many of the great names in modern historiography. Some of the well-known books in those days were the Cambridge History of India, Cambridge History of the World, the Oxford and Cambridge universities have taken initiative in writing books on world history. They were not as comprehensive as the works of Arnold Toynbee, who later wrote the study of history, which is a very comprehensive series of study of world history. Or Will Durant's, the UN version edited books, Culture of Civilization. This was long before Vivekananda went to college in 1870s. So the only source book available at the time was some of the traditional books like Gibbon's Decline and Fall of Roman Empire, or Green's history, and also the Cambridge history of Europe and Cambridge history of world civilizations. So this kind of critical and analytical study of history was very popular. It was not even known during Vivekananda's time. So based on his own ideas, he says harmony and synthesis are the two important tools for understanding the dynamics of the human progress along the lines of civilization and culture. And again, this life is a tremendous assertion of freedom, and this obedience to the law carried far enough would make us simply matter, either in society or in politics or religion. This is a very, very important concept. I need to explain this further. Vivekananda says all rules and regulations, all constitutions, beginning with European context, Western context, from Magna Carta onwards to modern constitutions, these are all necessary evils. We need constitutions for want of a better alternative. So the highest civilization, the highest refinement is achieved when we naturally, spontaneously obey the rules and regulations which are already there in the constitution. Remember, this is the interpretation that comes from a spiritual person, not from an academic historian. An academic historian can never think of doing away with constitution. Only a spiritual mystic can think of a time when humanity naturally obeys the rules and regulations which are already there in constitution, without the need of a law enforcement, without need of a court of law. So he says this is a real freedom. Very interesting. This is a real freedom. The real freedom is achieved when we don't need a policeman behind us. Then we don't need a court of law to enforce law. When we don't need a constitution to safeguard it, because a human being naturally follows the teachings, the instructions of his own soul. Again, this is a tall order, but again I have to remind you, these ideas came not from a constitutional expert or academic historian, but from a spiritual mystic. So we should give margin to that extent. And then another Vivekananda says, he says, the fight between secular and spiritual. And remember, even in late 19th century, the idea of separation of church and state. In fact, the credit should go to Napoleon Bonaparte, even to bring up this idea, mostly because of the tyrannical influence of the hierarchical Catholic religion on different walks of life in France at that time. French Revolution and the influence of Catholic Church in all areas of life in France. And Napoleon's attempt to liberate France from the stranglehold of religion. So in fact, the first attempt to separate church and state was made by him, historically speaking. Now the point is, of course, Henry VIII did in a very, very derisive way, but Napoleon was a much more refined person. Anyway, so Vivekananda says, there need not be any separation between the church and state, between the secular and spiritual, because there need not be any difference between the secular and spiritual. This again, remember, this is a spiritual perspective. When we can look upon our secular activities as not different, as non-distinct from spiritual activities. To worship is to pray, and to pray is to worship, he says in another context on the same topic. So, spiritualization of the secular, administration, law enforcement, constitutional activities, all can be part of our spiritual life. Nothing needs to be separated, detached from spirituality. So, we need not draw a line of demarcation between prayer, worship, and so-called spiritual activities and secular activities like farming, working in a information technology, or maybe in a university or a hospital or whatever it is. Every activity can be and should be done in a spiritual manner. This again is part of his definition. He says, reading spirit into matter. I mean, so-called material also, so-called material activity also should be done in a spiritual manner. Studying in a university, in a college, it should not be non-spiritual. The problem of drawing a line of demarcation is when you believe I can pray every day morning for 1 hour, or I can go to the church or a temple once a week, then every act of worship becomes a kind of license renewal program. Letting of the steam. For 6 days, secular activities. 1 day, God took rest, spiritual. So Vivekananda says, no, God doesn't take rest. So there is no scope for separating the secular from the spiritual. Again, this is this very unique concept, reading spirit into matter. Everything in this world can be spiritualized. That's why this is faith and character, etc. Remember, Vivekananda's concept of education, his perspectives on education, also takes a radical form in certain areas, especially when he comes heavily upon some of the social injustices which had crept into some of the Oriental civilizations like the Indian, Chinese, and so on. He admires the dynamism, the energy, the modern adventurous spirit of Europeans. For example, he admires, in one way, he admires the adventurous spirit that took Europeans to different corners of the world. Stanley's visits, exploring this South African continent, Captain Cook's discovery of the sea route to Australia, New Zealand, all those places. He refers to that indirectly. And he also even talks about Spanish Armada and the destruction of Spanish Armada by the British. He talks about Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh. They were all pirates, but still, the adventurous spirit that helped Great Britain to again begin. But remember, he came very heavily upon the exploitation, the colonization, the cruelty, all days. He was ruthless. Swami Vivekananda was absolutely uncompromising in his criticism of the colonial exploitation. But he also admires the adventurous spirit. So his admiration for the good things in all cultures, without, of course, forgiving for the wrong things they did. Coming to India, for example, Swami Vivekananda talks about some of the social injustices that crept into Indian society. Casteism, and again keeping a large number of people out of the focus of religious life that he comes in. And in that context, he insists on studying some of the ancient books. So what happened in India was, in the later centuries, a lot of new ideas often formulated by the priestly classes and the ruling monarchs, came into existence, which excluded a large number of people away, to keep them away or outside of the world of privileges. I mean, they were not given freedom to worship in temples, not everywhere, but in some places. Now, Vivekananda comes heavily upon this. And also, he criticizes the lack of freedom among the women folk. Again, he points out this was a later development. In the Vedic times, till about 9th century AD, in India, women were accorded same status. In some places, higher status than men. Women education was a very important part of ancient Vedic culture. See, for example, of course, there are many, many verses that he refers to. Many of the Vedic statements which emphasized giving total freedom to women for education, in spiritual life. Can you imagine, in India, women were employed as priests in some of the most prominent temples, right up to around 800 AD, in the Vedic times. But later on, many other practices and conventions came into force, and they were deprived of all this. So Vivekananda says, one statement is, he says, we should go back to the Vedic times. In Indian tradition, there are 3 canons which defined what is appropriate in philosophy, in social practice, in family values. What is the most appropriate, what is the most authentic, what is to be upheld? Shruti or Vedas, 1. Smritis or constitutional works, 2nd. 3rd is mythological books, Puranas. 3 canons in Hindu Vedantic tradition. So these are Upanishads are so universal, which teach you to look upon all human beings as one spiritual family. No distinction of caste, color, rich and poor, privileged or underprivileged, no, absolutely no difference. The whole humanity is looked upon as one spiritual family. It was this great ideal that helped the early kings to welcome all these migrants who came from Israel, who came from Persia, who came from other countries. India is called an ethnological museum. So many different races, like you can imagine, altogether 23 very important literary traditions, different languages. If you count the number of languages, more than 300. Anyway, that's a different story. So in ancient times, in the Vedic times, Vivekananda reminds, there was this rule of Upanishads, Vedas, which was universal. We taught that the whole humanity is one spiritual family, Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam. You can find an expression of this quotation you can find inscribed in the old temple at the Filbert Street entrance. Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti. Truth is one, but it's called by different names. Then Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam. The whole humanity is one spiritual family. But in later centuries, especially when foreign invasions increased from 8th century AD onwards, number of new rules and regulations came into force, including many divisive practices. Just like, for example, in European history, you find this Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, you have heard of it, Crusades, of course. Even in modern times, South Africa, apartheid, all these social injustices. Like that, many social injustices crept into this society. Vivekananda says it's all because we give importance to secondary books, not the primary text. The primary texts are the Vedas, which teach the entire humanity is one spiritual family. It will teach you that if you pray to God, then you should look upon every human being near in your neighborhood as an expression of the divine, because everyone is an expression of the divine. There is God living in everyone. Not that you are God, I am God, not at all. The point is, in every living being, there is the presence of the divine. So if you hurt an ant, insect, or a human being, for the matter, you are actually insulting God himself. True spirituality goes beyond the walls of temples. True spirituality happens when we look upon entire humanity as one spiritual family. Vivekananda says we should go back to this ancient Vedic concept of life. So you can imagine, as a spiritual person, on the one hand, he had something very interesting to teach about cultures and civilizations. Every civilization should, every culture should try to preserve spiritual values, especially in this modern time, modern age of the onslaught of science and technology. And then maybe the most important contribution, I would say, was his idea of harmony and synthesis of values, practices, positive values, practices, merits of different cultures and traditions. One striking quotation comes from him, and historically is very important. You know, in 1853, Japan was opened up for foreign trade. If you look at the history of the world, it is Japan. Japan was a closed society, very isolated society, till 1853. And Commodore Perry, an American naval captain, he went to Japan and he forced them to open their ports for foreign trade. Till then, till 1853, Japan was a closed society. The samurai system, ninja, all those. They found that their samurais cannot confront modern soldiers armed with the latest rifles and cannons. So physical heroism and courage will not be able to withstand gunpowder, especially modern mechanized artillery and well-trained infantry. So Japan was compelled to open its forts and for foreign trade. And within almost 10-12 years, Japan completely transformed himself into a modern country. The extent in 1905, in the well-known battle, they completely destroyed the Russian fleet, which was much more advanced technically. Japan could transform itself into a modern country. And Vivekananda says they could do that because they imbibed all the positive virtues of Western culture, Western tradition, and Western high-tech way of doing things. Science and technology, modern methods of organization, institutional running and institutions, all these positive virtues of Occidental culture. Japan could imbibe, but without losing their own traditional culture. And that's what I'm going to emphasize. So Swami Vivekananda says, in modern times, all of us should try to imbibe this concept of cultural harmony, synthesis. We should bring together all the positive virtues of different cultures and traditions. And here, I'm quoting Vivekananda himself. There in Japan, you find a fine assimilation of knowledge and not its indigestion as we have here. This is very interesting, and maybe this needs some explanation. He had visited Japan on his way from India to Chicago in his first journey in 1893. And 1893, that's not long after the opening of Japan in 1853. So Japan had achieved something marvelous. Science and technology, they're as good, if not better than many European countries or America. At the same time, they had not completely given up their own traditional values, culture, family values, sanctity and sacred. Maybe now things may be changing, but not till last 30 years ago. Of course, I'm not forgetting the problems of Second World War, which is a terrible episode. That's the part of imperial, practicing the wrong elements of the imperial ambition. It's a different story. But I'm talking about what Vivekananda saw in Japan in the last decade of 19th century. What he saw was this. They tried to imbibe the best of the Western, especially the dynamism, the concept of modernity, the scientific temper, the importance of science and technology in running a country, a nation, and institutions. That's very important. Vivekananda found opposite in India, at that time, not now, mind you. At that time in India, there was this orthodox conservative attitude. Science and technology we don't need. We can read some old Puranas, some ancient books, that's enough. Very, very similar to what Japanese were doing before the great opening in 1853. So Swami Vivekananda says, what we need today is the harmonious, friction-free blending, a synthesis of the best of different nations, cultures, and civilizations. No culture, no civilization is inferior or superior. Every nation, every culture, every civilization, every race has its own contribution, positive contribution to make the totality of world spirituality or world civilization. Each can learn something from the other. So this was his unique idea of the concept of harmony and synthesis, friction-free harmonization. That's what he called it. Without any friction, we should be able to harmonize a synthesis, synthesize the best of the Occidental with the best of the Oriental. This was a unique concept. You have to remember, these are not the views of a modern 21st century historian. These are the views of a great spiritual person. Vivekananda was primarily a spiritual teacher and not an academic historian. But from a spiritual perspective, when you look at the unfoldment, this panorama of the unfoldment of human civilization, what will you think about it? The destiny of humanity, the mistakes we may have made in the past, how we can avoid repeating those mistakes in future and make this world a better world by harmonizing spirituality on the one hand and high-tech scientific temper on the other. A kind of harmonious blending of the merits of both. I have tried to give just a bird view of some of Vivekananda's perspectives. It's a very important subject. Vivekananda's complete works will have an enlarged edition very soon. Right now we have 9 editions. There will be another edition coming very soon. So those of you who want to know more, you can read his works. You can find many such wonderful ideas. So thank you. Namaskar. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. Now we have announcements. The subject for next Sunday is Swami Subodhananda, a monastic disciple of Sri Ramakrishna. This talk will be given by Swami Vedanta ji. Childcare is provided during our Sunday lectures. On Sunday evenings, there is an online class at 6 p.m. It's an online class on the foundational text of Indian philosophy. The Zoom and YouTube links are available on our website homepage as well as in the monthly bulletin. On Wednesday evenings, we have Vespers with meditation at 7:30 p.m. in this auditorium. On Friday evenings, there's a scripture class at the Old Temple at 7:30 p.m. Please use the auditorium entrance on Filbert Street. So the address is 2961 or 2963, but the same Webster Street. That's the Old Temple. Beginning this Friday, the new text for study will be Vivekananda of Shankaracharya. It's an important Vedantic text. The class will be held at the Old Temple, Webster Street, 2961. Please come to the Filbert Street entrance for entering. You and your friends are cordially invited to attend all of our services. After the lecture, there will be a Q&A, question and answer session in Vivekananda Hall. They all are welcome. Thank you. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.